Hello, welcome to IN, a series of online conversations with practitioners in the visual arts. IN is broadcast by New Local Space, a microgallery and contemporary art initiative in Kingston, Jamaica, and a subsidiary of audio production house Creative Sounds. This episode is brought to you with support from the Prince Claus Fund Next Generation Partnership. Today I'm speaking with Kearra Amaya Gopee. Kearra Amaya Gopee is a Trinidadian artist who has presented work in New York and across the Caribbean, at Alice Yard in Trinidad and Tobago, the Caribbean Studies Association's conference in Haiti, and at the Ludwig Foundation in Cuba. Most recently, they were a part of the Block Party at Jenkins Johnson Projects in Brooklyn, New York, and Home at Caribbean Cultural Center's Augmented Reality exhibition. Gopee graduated from New York University in 2017 with a BFA in Photography and Imaging with a minor in Africana Studies. This year, they completed a residency at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. Hi, Kearra. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, for having me.
I want to start with a very basic question. What do you consider to be your primary medium?
I would say that my primary medium is photography, even though I don't really work exclusively in photography anymore. I just kind of use a bunch of different mediums to create kind of dynamic installations. But I would still say I'm a photographer, though.
Mm-hmm. What are the major concerns you have within your practice?
In my practice, I think I work from my own experiences to start with, to try to articulate experiences with memory and migration, and explaining how these movements and situations are racialized and gendered in the Caribbean and its diaspora by large. But my interests vary widely, even though I always use the Caribbean as a jump off point for it. As both, and then when I talk about the Caribbean, I'm talking about it as both like an imaginary and real space, because I realize that there's a distinction between the two depending on where you are in the world.
How do you address these concerns through your medium, be it photography or whatever else you find yourself working with?
I find that I use image-based media in particular because there's so much to see, and so much about the Caribbean is about seeing, but then also there's so much abroad, so much about the Caribbean that cannot be seen or encapsulated in an image. So for me, there's a limit to what a still image can do for the Caribbean. I feel like in a place like the Caribbean where so much of communication is definitely oral, but a lot of it is gesture-based, a lot of things are movement-based, and it's such a rich sonic landscape, I started to use a variety of mediums to talk about it, because I felt like, for me personally, photos just wasn't doing the region justice. Some people are good at doing it with a still image, and I say thank God for y'all, but I'm not that good at it. So I usually try to make things that are a little bit more holistic in how they're rendered, reflect that complexity of the space.
You've given us a bit of an idea of how your process starts, because you said you started from personal experience. Could you give us more of an idea about the entire process or the duration of the process, the things you're grappling with specifically in the work, and also what kinds of specific experiences led you here?
Well, a lot of it comes from me being generally unfixed. So when I talk about coming from personal experience, I'm talking about the fact that I was born in Miami with Trinidadian parents, moved back to Caribbean when I was 4, and I stayed in Trinidad until I was 17. And then I moved back to the States for school. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes from, a lot of the work, the process of the work comes from me actually processing experiences that I've had myself as a person who was born in Miami to Trinidadian parents, and then moved back to Trinidad when I was 4 due to strange migration circumstances. But then through making the work, I realized I learn while I'm making work. And I learn a lot from just interfacing with people on a regular basis. And through my work, I kind of end up making a platform to talk to more people about what exactly was my experience, and seeing how that experience was actually not unique to me, and seeing how it was actually shared. So, for example, I did a trilogy of work on, I'm finishing the last part now here. The first part was basically Artifact 1, Tiger Bomb, where I just made this dresser and, put a two-way mirror in it with a video piece playing in the mirror to talk about, the fact that my father had restricted my mother from traveling by taking a green card. And I only found out about that when I was like 20, maybe 21, and trying to articulate that, hearing about that experience secondhand from my mother and trying to make sense of it ended up being this whole installation. And what happens when I make things like this is that I try my best to get a lot of Caribbean people to come to the work, to come see the work while I'm in New York. Because then what happens is that they find me and they talk to me about their own experiences with being held hostage due to with patriarchal structures in both places, and about how, their lives have been affected by these things. So for me, the process never really ends in the work for me per se. A lot of it is about, while I'm making it intuitively. Because sometimes I will think about something and I'm just like, well, I'm not sure exactly how formally this relates to what I'm trying to say. But I'm learning now to like trust that process a little bit more and things reveal itself in time. So through the process, I'm working very, very much with what is available to me in place. Like that's important to me, like the actual provenance of items, like where they come from, why is it relevant to me or what I'm trying to say, and how can I source it locally best as possible. So that in itself is a process that you have to talk to laborers and workers and people who have experience dealing with things on a variety of levels. And then through that process, I end up doing more research, both underground and actual formal research. And then at the end, what happens is that I make this thing and the work is still in process because people are still talking to me about it. So because of that, the work also tends to be very modular. I would, for example, with the same dresser piece, it's not uncommon for me to change up what exactly is there in response to who the audience is and who is going to be, talking to me, and where is the gallery, who's talking about it. Like, if it's sitting in public space, it makes a difference. The things change that are in it. And yeah, that plus accessibility. So the work is always in process for me. It never really stops being in process. It's always responsive to the people to whom it's most relevant, basically.
You're from Trinidad. You spent your formative years there, but as a young adult moved to the United States to pursue art school. And therefore, some of your most recent bodies of work were made in the United States. You're addressing issues of gender, race, erasure. How do these issues, gender, sexuality, race, play out for you in these two environments, Trinidad and the U.S., the Caribbean and the U.S.? Are there more similarities than not, or more differences? How are they distinct? And or how do they relate to each other, these two spaces and the work in these two spaces?
I mean, okay. So this question is tricky to answer because, fundamentally, to get this really clear and out of the way, like anti-blackness is everywhere. When it comes to things being raised a specific way, I do feel as if the same problems manifest themselves differently in different places. And in response to my actual body, because I can only speak for myself, as somebody who is, visibly black, apparently a woman, which I don't necessarily identify as, how my body is received in these places are really coming from just general white hegemony. So I wouldn't say that it's different, but the manifestations are different. But I do think that in Trinidad, the optics of race are different. Like the way race works in two different places naturally, different. But I think the optics of race in Trinidad are definitely more prevalent. Like if you see you and you look black, you probably are black. But then there's I wouldn't say there's a complication, but there's so many different racial categorizations that don't exist in the U.S. But I feel like in the U.S. though, the one-drop rule is still very, very prevalent. And I'm not saying that Trinidad is exceptional in our acceptance of the fact that people are mixed or whatever, but it is definitely influenced by ideas of colorism, and it creates a whole different, sort of strata. So, for example, me being, I look black, so I am black. And that's it in both places. But then Trinidadians, once they find out certain facts about me, say like my last name or, where my family is from, the idea of what my race is definitely abstracts itself a little bit more. So then questions become, oh, well, if you have an Indian last name, why don't you look like XYZ? So we have this idea of what a ideal mixed person looks like, and it's not a dark-skinned person. And that in itself is a problem. And yeah, and my body definitely is different in both places and how my physical body is received. I feel like in both places there's like a hastiness to assume and gender people, but that act of gendering somebody comes directly after having been racialized. So once you have been racialized in a particular way, it opens the gateway to then ascribe gender and the particularities of the gender that they assume you are upon you. So once they say, people don't want to admit this, but once you are a particular shade, certain things about your body become less deviant in terms of how you interact with people in society. So for me, I do a lot of work about erasure because I definitely deal a lot with erasure as a way of getting by. People erase you all the time once you don't subscribe to particular ways of being. I don't think that's local to any one place.
How then does your work function or respond in each of these spaces?
So this has been tricky because the work comes from such a personal place, and it's usually me speaking very explicitly about things that have happened to me or things that have been happening to people around me and people who are close to me. I always have to consider positionality more than anything else. I'm living in New York. Most of my work is shown in the States. I'm functionally a member of the diaspora who visits more or less every year. So considering, well, who exactly am I talking to? Why am I talking to them? And then there's also the liminality that kind of comes with that, part and parcel, and how best I can articulate that. So basically the work is nebulous, and it kind of can change in terms of form because I myself am constantly in process. So the work remains in process, like I said earlier. Yeah, the work, like I said, it just responds to place in as best a way as I can muster.
Do you think, or have you had the opportunity to think about how the work specifically would function in a space like the Caribbean? I mean, you've spoken about the diaspora interacting with your work in the U.S., but have you thought specifically about it placed in the Caribbean?
I have thought about it, and the reality of the situation is that I was very late to art. I didn't realize I was making art or considering what I was doing art until I was like 17. Therefore, I haven't really shown much in the Caribbean. And I think about how well people can access a story about migration in such a way in Trinidad, when a lot of people, even though their stories are less centered, if you haven't left Trinidad for particular reasons, your story is less about migration and more about being in this place. I can speak about my experience as being a product of this place, but it's tricky how I haven't had enough chances to show in the Caribbean for me to determine exactly what that would look like. But I personally feel like I have enough that people can access, because who doesn't have a auntie or a sister or cousin who has gone through similar things that I've gone through, or you have gone through it yourself. I don't think it's that hard to connect to, but you definitely will have to kind of push yourself to see beyond your own experiences to access it in a particular way, because it speaks so explicitly to being kind of rootless.
A part of that lack of opportunity of showing in the Caribbean is not simply because you have recently completed art school and have been in the U.S., but it's about also spaces and infrastructure to actually exhibit that work within the Caribbean being less available and just less existing. There's those kinds of spaces aren't existing as much as they are
Exactly.
in the US.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, on a totally local level, it's extremely difficult to show work, but then it's also like an education problem. Is at the core of it is also, is this work even necessary or valid? And I think a lot of that, the lack of those spaces comes from a general laissez-faire attitude towards arts and cultural programming that is not explicitly, I hate to say this, explicitly carnival focus or folk, I use quote unquote folk, related. So I don't think there's a lot of room for innovation to even start creating these spaces, specifically in Trinidad. And I think it's generally like an education flaw, like what we prioritize with children, what we think is useful, what is a useful skill. Like in Trinidad, we have a whole registry that, well, it's not a registry per se, but they have a list where they say, well, these are the jobs that Trinidad needs. And art is not high on that list. And then it's hard to campaign to get any money from the state, because the state should be invested in funding art initiatives, because creativity is necessary for pushing any sort of national consciousness, I think. But the state should be involved in that, but they are not, because it has not been deemed as appropriate. And so that trickles down to parents telling children, well, this is not a viable source. It's good that you're good at it, but you don't get to do this full time. Thus, there are and there's also no room for, because of this lack of space, there's barely any room for a lot of creatives to set up and have like a whole professional practice. A lot of people are doing it with aid from the private sector. Definitely the private sector is a major part of like arts and creating institutions. But a lot of those are clustered in particular places in Trinidad. Like there isn't a lot of private parties trying to necessarily branch out and decenter Port of Spain from our art making activities. I see San Fernando is coming up, and then there's a new initiative in the East called East Yard, which is good. But I think more of these local spaces need to pop up because people need them to be there. So yeah, there is that's definitely a factor in why I haven't shown a lot, because there's only so many places that one could show and have it well received. Yeah, it's just a at the core like a government, and it's an education issue per se, I think.
What are you working on while you're here at NLS?
So I'm doing 3 things now. It was supposed to be 2 things, but now I'm kind of tying up work that I did over the summer while I was at Skohegan. So I spoke about Artifact 1 earlier, and now I'm working on Artifact 3, which is a new. It's like the last chapter in this trilogy I've been working on about my mother and my grandmother and myself, and how our lives have been impacted by migration and gender-based violence and loss of memory, and thinking about how the archive plays itself out in that sphere. So this last video piece / installation I'm working on ends that. And so the first one was from my mom's perspective, and then the second one is from my grandmother's perspective. Well, not her perspective, but from my interactions with my grandmother. And then this last one is about myself, which is why it's so hard, because who wants to talk about themselves? And in it, I'm kind of grappling with, yes, the fact that we have been moving and are still moving all the time is definitely a major part of Caribbean history. But for me personally, because of this movement, I see the Caribbean as a very generative space. So this also goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where I was thinking about the Caribbean as both an imagined place and a real place. So what I'm thinking about with Terra Nullius is basically using scrying, which is a technique that spiritual practitioners use to see into the past, to the present, to the future. And coming from that idea of scrying, I'm projecting this video into this bucket of liquid, indistinguishable liquid, to create my own attempt at scrying, to imagine what a future would look like where families can migrate and families are more flexible without their prescription to traditional structures of family, and how non-nuclear families can build in the Caribbean and imagine new possibilities for themselves. So that's it. That's just the gist of it. It's a lot. I'm still working through a lot of it. So there's that, and then I have a separate photo series that I'm working on. That is basically about thinking about how images are consumed of the Caribbean elsewhere, in particular to the lives of people who are LGBTQ. I started this photo series where I kind of photograph people performing like this calculated refusal of the lens of the camera as a way to reject this sort of consumption that is usually happening, because we always have, like in Jamaica, there's the gully queens, and people go and they photograph the gully queens, and then what happens after that? They get no benefits. They rarely ever have any agency in having their image being shown else. They rarely have any agency or any capital gain from having been in these images, having their lives exploited for profit. And that's just one instance of it. So with this project, I'm really just trying to talk to queer Jamaicans, LGBTQ Jamaicans, and Trinidadians when I get back there in a few months, about their experiences being here and their relationship to ideas of consumption in and outside of the Caribbean, and working collaboratively to create portraits. So the portraits could be portraits in the sense are not necessarily limited to a formal image with the person staring directly into the camera. It could be the things that constitute to you the essence of your being. So it could be, I've done some still lives with people where they just put certain objects together and they say, well, this accurately represents me. My body can be in the public for particular reasons, because there's so many repercussions that can still, the reality of the situation is that there's so many repercussions that can come from you essentially outing yourself to be photographs, even though this focus on your body doesn't really say anything about your well-being as a LGBTQ person or your aspirations. It doesn't say anything about how you build community. It doesn't do any of those things. So this photo series is really just me talking to people and being like, well, do you think you even need visibility in the conventional sense? Then how can we thwart that together? Let's talk about it. So I've been doing that. And then the last thing I was doing was the Wikipedia editathons that I do with the Black Lunch Table. The Wikipedia editathons, basically, I, with the help of Black Lunch Table, help to train people in using Wikipedia to, specifically for this project, to write articles on the lives of like Black Jamaican artists, because there is definitely a lack of articles on Black Jamaican artists online that are easy to access. If Wikipedia is the first point of access for most people to start doing research on a person, what does it mean when you can't find an article on them? And how can you combat that? People don't know that Wikipedia is definitely a aggregation of secondary sources, but it is largely authored by volunteers, people who just feel like having this information be accessible to the general public is necessary. And for me, the Wikipedia thing is very important because it's just me being like an active citizen in helping to write and source images about people, so that there isn't a lag between what information gets to people from different social strata. Like, there's so many barriers to information, especially about art. So Wikipedia kind of democratizes the whole thing. And yeah.
Do you see the Wikipedia workshop as part of your overall art practice?
I would say that, it's a tricky question, because I would say yes, because my art practice is really just my life practice and how I process information and how I privilege information. So in a way, it could be said that it is, but I don't think it's that easy. I think that to be involved in a project like this is definitely how I can be more engaged personally in ensuring that there's less late career artists that like myself. I feel as if I had the information, if I had the ability to look up these things easily, because I spent the majority of my life on the internet, if I knew where to look, and I probably would have started art a lot earlier. I probably would have thought about what I was doing as creative practice a lot earlier. So a lot of this is really just what I prioritize as information. And it also just comes from me having experience with archives and having worked in an archive and knowing how, again, accessibility, how difficult it is to even get to some of these things. So just trying to make all these things happen for other people. So it's not part of my practice, but it is part of my life.
Given that working on this archive is a component of your residency, how do you think about social practice, protest art, and activism in personally and as an artist?
Basically, I feel as if there's a type of social practice happening now, right? Where it's definitely been co-opted and literally morphed into something that people can use to virtue signal about what they're concerned about. So you support this art that says this statement about the problem that creates the necessity for this problem to exist, that creates the need for this work to exist, and directly feeds back into it. I think protest art can definitely, protest art and social practice, you have to tread lightly when you're doing it now. You have to make sure that it is for the people you say it's for. And if it is for the people you say it's for, then how are these people going to be able to access the work you're making? If you're going to show the protest art in these high-end places that a lot of poor people who you're making the work about, because you're probably from a similar background, some people, I don't want to assume that, but a lot of people, that's a reality. You're making this work, but then it only gets shown in high-end places. And the only reason why you were lucky enough to be able to visit these places were because of you probably had a parent that really wanted you to get involved in art, or, your school was an art school and they push for kids to go there all the time, but that's not the reality for a lot of people. So then at that point, it becomes more of it feels a lot more like an anthropological exercise where you are looking at a situation and then rendering how you feel about it in a way that is not directly beneficial to the people who it's about. And those people become decentered, and it becomes about you and you making a statement about what is happening. And then that in turn begets the question, well, who are you making protest work for? To make protest work and not actively be engaged in some other way, I think, for me personally, it doesn't necessarily work. I think that it's one thing, like a comment is not a comment on the social situation, right? The comment on the situation right now isn't necessarily doesn't necessarily mean an end to the situation itself. And I know artists know that, but a comment can only go so far depending on who's able to access the work and why and when. So yeah, I think for me personally, I try to be a little bit more engaged in how my work is shown. And even if my work is going to be shown in a place where a lot of Caribbean people can't access it, then I'm on the phone with somebody like, well, how can we make sure that this is promoted in XYZ places? Is this going to be here? Okay, so who do we have to talk to get people from X point to Y point? Because it isn't for you. You're interested in it, and that's great, but it's also not for you. So how can we create that space for the people who need to see work and social practice, who need to see protest art? How can we facilitate space for them to actually see it? And I think another thing that I try to do as well is probably just making sure that you know who is doing the work in the streets that makes your work possible. A lot of it is like organizations and organizers actively working against the problems that you're making work about, reach out to them and probably talk to them like, how can I be in service of you? How can I assist with this? And it doesn't have to be you on the front lines in the streets. No, like, you can actually just ask people what they need and try to fulfill that need with what you have as much as possible. I read this article the other day about how to, that was this really long detailed list on how to not make social practice about you and how to not center it on yourself and how to not make it about your conscience. And yeah, it just hit a lot of the points that I was just thinking about or talking about. To practice, making your work accessible to all the people who need to see it is definitely one thing for sure. And then you also just have to make sure that you're just not talking about yourself and what you feel, and you're not letting yourself be co-opted by people who will want to use your work who will want to weaponize your work to make a point about themselves as well. You just can't take every opportunity that comes your way. So those kinds of things to me cheapens that type of work. I think activism and art have a long history of working together, but we really need to work really hard to push against this co-optation that's happening and monetization of social practice, especially if none of the money goes to anybody who's featured in the work or the work is about. Because I think that also activists can benefit a lot from being close to artists. And artists steal from activists all the time, but activists could do a lot stealing from us in terms of creativity and refreshed approaches to organizing people in this particularly tense time. You would need creativity to come up with solutions and tactics with which you combat whatever is, your focus at that point in time. And I think activists can learn a lot from artists in that way. Just a note, I'm not trying to be prescriptive. Do whatever you want with your life. Whatever you think is right. You don't got to prove it to me. I'm sure you're doing something great.
What has this past year entailed for you as an artist versus last year when you were in art school? How have things changed for you, and what have you had to grapple with?
The last year has been a lot. I've had to grapple a lot with trying to figure out what exactly I want for my practice and what I want my practice to do for my life, and how to maintain a practice when the money is precarious, where you don't know exactly where it's coming from. At a given point in time, like, every artist I know has at least 4 jobs that are not related to art, but I'm also wondering how sustainable is that to your life? Like, why? I know the work is the work and it has to be done. I know we feel a compulsion to do the work, but at the end of the day, you're burnt out. You can't even focus on the work itself. So it's really just thinking about where is the most generative space for me to be able to make work and maintain a healthy financial life, and trying to pinpoint what exactly that location is. Like, for me personally, I'm thinking very seriously about leaving New York, because one, New York needs to be decentered from art, absolutely, in the same way that Port of Spain needs to be decentered from art, because you can't cluster everything that's good there. The city literally does not have the room, and gentrifiers follow artists, and artists are often gentrifiers, and they ruin the total landscape of a city because, developers prey on them. And they signify that something cool is coming to an area, and it makes it justifiable for them to disrupt people, even though they don't actually care about art. They just care about what art can possibly open the gateway for them financially. So thinking about my own complicity in that, and thinking about my financial circumstances and the type of work I want to make, because I definitely do make my best work when I'm in the Caribbean. I think best. Usually when I am trapped with an idea or concept or something, I go home and it clears itself up somehow. And I realize that that's just one of the best places for me to be. And by doing that, I'm not complicit in a larger structure that prioritizes some people over some others. And I can sleep at night knowing that I didn't really contribute to something of that nature. So in the first year, it's just kind of putting things together to be able to make that more consistent. Then I've also been thinking about who my work is talking to. A lot of the time, it's as I lean more and more into splitting my life into, it's hard to make work that it's a challenge to make work that is accessible on multiple levels or can be interpreted on multiple levels so that people in the Caribbean can tap into it and then people in the diaspora can tap into it. And I'm learning that it's super necessary for me to have that. And I think another thing as well is being selective about what opportunities you take really comes, again, from what your financial situation is. And trying to make work that is ephemeral in the way that I make work, ephemeral and modular, and not being very in love with my work being sold. It's very difficult to try to sustain your life because you're not selling work, you're just making objects and you're showing work, but you're not making any money from it. And trying to figure out, well, what's the best way to participate in art, but not participate in art will fuel capitalism. How to make it so that my work is not being used to aid and abet larger situations that are beyond myself, essentially. And how can I hold myself accountable in these situations? Yeah, just being selective.
What do you have coming up?
What I have coming up is grad school. Already put everything in, so hopefully in September I'll be moving to a new city, which will be exciting. I have more Wikipedia workshops scheduled in the Caribbean. I'll be spending some time at Alice Yard in the next few months, so that's going to be there. And I'm working on coming up with the scripts for some new video work that I'm thinking about and have been thinking about for a while, but I just haven't been in the correct place to actually manifest it. So while I'm in Trinidad, I'll have the time to make this new piece of work. I have a few residencies for next year, and that's about it. It's a quiet year.
Thank you, Kearra.
You're welcome.